Step across the threshold and you enter a world where faith and fear were woven into the same tightening rope, each strand pulling medieval believers closer to salvation or damnation. This was the era when the church's voice ruled louder than kings, and every whispered command carried the weight of eternity. To question authority was to question God, and in a world built on obedience, doubt was treated not as a thought, but as a threat. Yet behind the sermons and stained glass, another doctrine thrived, one never sung in hymns, yet carved into the bones of countless victims. It was the doctrine of purification through suffering, a grim belief that pain could cleanse the soul the way fire purges metal. And from this belief emerged tools, rituals, and chambers designed not merely to punish the body, but to break the spirit until it lay trembling beneath the altar of obedience. For centuries, the church concealed these methods behind scripture, authority, and fear, ensuring that what happened in the name of purification would rarely be questioned and almost never remembered. But history has cracks, and through those fractures, the truth still seeps like old blood rising to the surface of forgotten stone. In this documentary, we step into those shadows, unearthing the secrets the church tried hardest to bury. 15 forms of torture so chilling, so ingeniously cruel, that even now they feel almost impossible to believe. But they were real. Real enough to break confessions from the innocent, real enough to bend nations into obedience, real enough to leave stains on history that no prayer could ever wash clean. To understand these tools is to understand the psychology of power, how a single institution shaped law, culture, and belief through the careful choreography of pain. It wasn't chaos, it was strategy. A system where suffering became currency, traded for confession, obedience, or the illusion of a purified soul. And every device you're about to witness carried its own twisted logic, its own dark theology, its own promise that torment could somehow serve the divine. But this journey isn't just about mechanisms of pain, it's about the mindset that allowed them to flourish. It's about the men who believed suffering revealed truth, about the accused who were trapped between devotion and terror, and about the society that accepted cruelty as the price of spiritual order. As we open the doorway to darkness, the air grows colder, the walls feel tighter, and the silence becomes a kind of witness, remembering what so many tried to forget. These 15 secrets are not relics of brutality alone, they are mirrors, reflecting the fragile boundary between righteousness and cruelty. Before we begin, remember this. The most terrifying tools were not forged in metal, but in belief. Belief that pain could save, and belief that obedience mattered more than mercy. So if you're ready to explore the shadows history tried to bury, to witness the rituals that turned sanctity into suffering, then step closer. The journey begins now, with the first and darkest threshold. But before we descend fully, take a breath and steady your thoughts. The world you are entering is built on whispers, accusations, and silent suffering. Here, every shadow hides a confession, and every corridor remembers a cry. This is the realm where faith became a weapon, sharpened by fear and authority. And as you continue, you will see how darkness grows when doubt is forbidden. Stay with me as we cross this final moment of calm before the storm begins. What follows will challenge your assumptions, disturb your certainty, and pull you deeper than you expect. They called it purification, a holy cleansing of corrupted souls. But in the dim chambers where these rituals unfolded, nothing felt sacred. The air hung heavy with the scent of sweat, fear, and whispered scripture, and the tools laid out on wooden tables gleamed like silent accusations. These were the church's earliest instruments of correction, forged under the belief that pain could wash away spiritual stains. And as twisted as it sounds now, medieval citizens accepted this logic, convinced that suffering was proof that God had not abandoned them. In the hands of inquisitors, torture became a ritual, a dark sacrament meant to drag truth out of trembling bodies. The first of these rituals began with ropes, pulleys, and the illusion of mercy. The strappado looked almost simple: wrists tied behind the back, a rope thrown over a beam, and a slow, deliberate lift that wrenched shoulders from their sockets. The method was praised for leaving no immediate marks, a godsend for those who needed bodies to look untouched for confession ceremonies. Victims dangled like broken silhouettes, joints tearing, breath shuddering, faith collapsing under the weight of their own suspended body. And as they hung in silence, the inquisitor would ask again, "Do you now confess?" Many did. Many would have confessed to anything. In one recorded case, a woman accused of heresy admitted to consorting with demons simply to feel her feet touch the ground again. Her confession was false, but the church accepted it as divine truth born from holy discipline. For more stubborn souls, those who could endure the first assault, there was a cruel variation: the sudden drop, a jolt powerful enough to rip muscles, shatter internal tissue, and leave nerves screaming for hours. Each drop felt like the body was tearing from the inside. This wasn't just punishment, it was a deliberate destruction of strength, breaking the will in stages until the victim's only prayer was for the agony to stop. And when they finally spoke, their words were shaped not by belief, but by the unbearable geometry of pain. The strappado became one of the church's earliest and most effective cleansing rituals, a device designed to make lies and truth indistinguishable. But the strappado wasn't the only tool sanctified by twisted logic. The heretic's fork, a deceptively small instrument, offered a different kind of torment, one carved into silence. Imagine a metal fork with two sharp prongs facing opposite directions, strapped between the breastbone and the underside of the jaw. Any movement, any nod, flinch, or desperate attempt to bow one's head in relief drove the points deeper. And above it, a single inscription: "I recant." Victims were forced to hold their heads rigid, eyes burning, breath shallow, muscles trembling. The fork punished hesitation, enforcing stillness as though stillness itself were confession. Some cracked within minutes, others endured for hours until exhaustion betrayed them, and every drop of blood was recorded as a sign that the soul was resisting purification. Then there were crushing devices disguised as holy tools: rosary presses shaped like devotional symbols, iron hand crushers carved to resemble relics, and even foot squeezers etched with scripture. These tools were designed with a dual purpose: to inflict pain while reminding the victim of the faith they were supposedly dishonoring. Fingers splintered beneath tightening screws, knuckles exploded, and bones flattened into pulps of unrecognizable flesh. The church claimed this destruction released the impurities locked within the body, as though sin itself hid in bone marrow. The contradiction was staggering. Relics meant to symbolize spiritual connection were repurposed as engines of agony. One of the most disturbing cases involved a priest accused of secretly translating forbidden texts. He was strapped into a crushing vise shaped like a devotional box used to store sacred fragments. With each turn of the screw, he recited prayers, begging forgiveness not for the crime, but for whatever sins had cursed him to this fate. After 3 hours, he confessed to heresy he had never committed. His words were accepted without scrutiny. His broken hands were deemed proof of divine judgment. Through these rituals, the church built a system where pain equaled truth and destruction equaled salvation. Victims learned quickly that confessing, even falsely, was often the only path out of darkness. And for inquisitors, every scream reinforced their belief that suffering was sacred. These early methods shaped the foundation of centuries of brutality, planting the idea that the body could be sacrificed to purify the soul. As we move deeper, the rituals grow darker, the tools more sinister, and the theology even more twisted. What comes next reveals how the church shifted from cleansing the soul to reshaping the very limits of human endurance. Step inside the chambers of the Inquisition, and the air itself seems to recoil. These were not rooms built merely to restrain the body. They were engineered to unmake the mind. Every stone, every chain, every device reflected a singular purpose: to remake reality around the accused until truth, lies, fear, and faith became indistinguishable. If the earlier tortures served as purification, this was something darker, a complete recalibration of the human spirit. And at the center of this machinery stood the Inquisitor, a man trained not just in scripture but in the architecture of terror. The rack was his masterpiece of authority, a wooden frame, deceptively simple, fitted with rollers at each end. The victim was tied by wrists and ankles, and as the Inquisitor turned the wheel, limbs stretched beyond nature's design. Tendons snapped, shoulders buckled, cartilage tore apart like damp parchment. Each rotation sent ripples of agony through the body, breaking resistance one scream at a time. But the brilliance of the rack was not its ability to mutilate, it was the calculated slowness. Victims could feel their bodies unraveling inch by inch, listening to their own joints betray them. Some confessed as soon as the ropes tightened. Others held on until the threshold of tearing became unbearable. Either way, the Inquisitor learned what he needed: when the mind begins to fracture. Nearby stood a device shrouded in both legend and shadow, the Iron Maiden. Historians debate its true medieval use, but the fear it inspired was undeniably real. A sarcophagus-shaped coffin lined with spikes, positioned with surgical precision so the victim would bleed slowly rather than die. The mere sight of it could twist the stomach into knots. Many were never placed inside. They were shown the maiden, forced to imagine the slow closing of its doors, the points brushing skin with intimate cruelty. That image alone often drove the accused into confessions. In this chamber, imagination became a weapon more powerful than steel. But not every tool needed grandeur. The thumbscrews were small enough to fit in a palm, yet capable of inflicting pain that radiated up the arms like fire racing through bone. The Inquisitor tightened the screw with deliberate rhythm, each turn crushing cartilage, turning joints into pulp. Victims watched their own fingers deform, blood seeping between metal teeth. The horror wasn't just the pain, it was the realization that something so small could destroy something so vital. Lives were built with hands, confessions were written with them. And as fingers collapsed under the screw, so did pride, defiance, and identity. Water torture, too, had its own grim logic. Victims were forced to swallow water until their stomachs felt ready to burst, drowning from the inside as liquid flooded throat and lungs. The sensation created panic almost instantly. The body believed it was dying long before the lungs actually filled. Others were subjected to the cold water test, bound and submerged repeatedly, pulled gasping into the air only to be plunged again. Water, a symbol of cleansing and baptism, became an instrument of choking terror. The Church claimed these rituals separated the innocent from the guilty, but in truth, they separated the strong from the broken. Yet the most devastating tools of the Inquisition were never carved from metal, they were psychological. Before a single wound was inflicted, the Inquisitor set the stage with precision. Sleep deprivation was often the opening act. Victims were kept awake for days under bright torchlight, questioned at random intervals until time dissolved into a blur. Minds deprived of rest became fertile ground for paranoia, hallucinations, and desperate compliance. Then came ritual humiliation. Clothes removed, heads shaved, names replaced with labels like sinner or heretic. Identity was stripped away piece by piece, leaving only fear and vulnerability. Some prisoners were forced to watch staged executions, actors pretending to confess, beg, and die horribly, creating the illusion that their only choices were confession or annihilation. The message was simple: pain awaits, and only obedience delays it. False promises of mercy played their own deadly role. Inquisitors would whisper that a confession meant forgiveness, that compliance might spare the victim's family, that God himself would look kindly upon cooperation. Many confessed to crimes they never imagined simply because mercy sounded like a rope thrown to a drowning man. Only later did they learn that mercy often meant a swifter execution rather than torture, and even that was never guaranteed. This arsenal, metal, water, sleep, fear, humiliation, worked in perfect harmony. Bodies broke, minds splintered, and confessions poured forth like blood from fresh wounds. And as we step deeper into this darkness, the next secrets reveal how torture evolved not only to extract truth, but to turn suffering into spectacle. The crackle of flames was more than heat, it was a voice, a message carved in smoke and terror. In the streets and squares of medieval towns, fire became the language of obedience, speaking directly to the hearts of the faithful. Public executions, branded as instruments of divine justice, transformed punishment into theater. The Church had learned that suffering displayed openly carried a dual purpose. It punished the accused while instructing the living. Flames licked flesh, but they also burned lessons into memory, leaving communities trembling beneath their shadow. Auto da fe, literally act of faith, was no mere ceremony. It was a ritualized affirmation of authority, a choreography of fear that united spectacle and faith into a single, terrifying performance. In these ceremonies, accused heretics were paraded through the streets, often bound in chains or strapped to wooden stakes. Citizens watched as they knelt, forced to witness their own condemnation as though it were part of the Mass. Branding irons, shaped like crosses or letters spelling out sins, seared flesh to mark transgression permanently. Each mark was intended as a physical warning to others. Sin could not be hidden, and God's judgment would manifest through church hands. For the condemned, the iron's heat was unbearable, an agony made more potent by the knowledge that it would be seen, remembered, and whispered about long after the skin healed. Slow burn executions were reserved for those the church wished to make unforgettable. Victims were tied to stakes and ignited with careful precision, often with flammable oils to prolong suffering. Flames curled around limbs, smoke clawed at lungs, and the screams of the dying became instruments of communal terror. Townspeople, assembled for sermons and spectacle alike, learned that defiance could be measured in minutes of agony and hours of public humiliation. This was punishment elevated to propaganda. Each execution was a demonstration that the church wielded both temporal and divine authority, and that obedience was not optional. Historical testimonies reveal the intense psychological weight of these moments. One account describes a young man accused of heresy, forced to watch a friend consumed by fire before him. The terror was both vicarious and anticipatory, breaking resistance without a single lash or iron touch. By the time the flames reached him, his soul and mind had already yielded. Another record details a woman branded on the forehead, her cries echoing across the marketplace. People whispered of God's wrath as her hands and face blackened, and the church's message spread far beyond the square. Fear, ritualized and visible, was a tool more powerful than any sermon. Flames were symbolic, representing divine judgment and purification simultaneously. The church argued that fire burned away sin, revealing the righteous core of the soul beneath. But the line between salvation and spectacle blurred, and often the public, rather than the condemned, became the true audience. In this, punishment served a dual role: correction for the sinner and instruction for the faithful. Religious leaders meticulously curated these events to maximize the impression on the community, staging the acts with ceremonial processions, prayers, and public readings of alleged confessions. Every moment was designed to imprint moral lessons into the collective consciousness, leaving no room for doubt that the church's authority extended from heaven to earth. Yet behind the pageantry, the terror was real, immediate, and deeply personal. Each scream, each branded mark, each curl of smoke was a reminder that faith could be enforced through fire, that divine judgment had a physical hand, and that compliance often required submission to unimaginable pain. These rituals, terrifying and deliberate, forged a culture in which sin was visible, fear was public, and authority was absolute. As we leave the squares of fire and shadow, the next secrets show a darker intimacy, how torture moved from spectacle to private chambers, where cruelty became personal, precise, and unflinchingly intimate. Not all torments left bruises or broken bones. Some of the church's most devastating punishments were invisible, a shadowed hand crushing the spirit while leaving the body untouched. These were the torments of exile, denial, and spiritual annihilation, punishments that existed outside the reach of physical sight, but burrowed into the mind with a persistence more cruel than steel. Excommunication was the starting point, a declaration that a soul was cut from the community of the faithful, barred from sacraments, prayers, and the sacred rites that ensured salvation. For a medieval person, this was more than social alienation. It was a sentence to eternal emptiness, a spiritual void that no earthly comfort could fill. Isolation followed swiftly. Monks, nuns, or laypeople could find themselves confined to cells where human contact was forbidden, the only companions being shadows and whispered reminders of sins. Days blurred into nights, hours stretching into weeks, and the mind began to fracture under the relentless pressure of loneliness. Letters from loved ones were denied, conversations silenced, and the outside world became a faint, unreachable memory. In these chambers, fear was constant, not fear of pain, but of non-existence, of being erased from divine favor. One account tells of a scholar accused of heresy left in a small room for months. He prayed, screamed, and whispered to walls that never answered. By the time he was released, he had lost his voice and, historians note, something deeper, the ability to trust his own thoughts. The church also wielded the threat of forbidden burial as a psychological weapon. To die without consecrated ground was a fate worse than any execution. Bodies left in unconsecrated soil, denied the comfort of prayers, were reminders that sin could follow even beyond death. Families shunned the accused. Graves became markers of shame rather than rest. The fear of this fate haunted many until they confessed to crimes they had not committed or surrendered to doctrines they did not believe. It was a form of torture that transcended flesh, reaching into memory, lineage, and the promise of eternity. Public shaming and removal from society amplified these effects. Those condemned were barred from marketplaces, towns, and gatherings, forced to watch their communities continue life while they existed as ghosts, visible yet untouchable. They were stripped of roles, professions, and the ability to participate in ordinary joys. The sense of invisibility, combined with the public acknowledgement of their shame, created a paradox: being socially alive but spiritually dead. Letters, trades, and friendships were severed systematically, each deprivation a deliberate psychological blow. Haunting these punishments was the ever-present fear of divine wrath. The church cultivated anxiety through sermons that reminded the faithful that eternal torment awaited unrepentant sinners. For the accused, the combination of isolation, shame, and the threat of damnation became an unrelenting mental siege. One woman, accused of secret pagan practices, was left in isolation for months. She prayed constantly, fearing both death and afterlife, until historians record her descent into madness. Her confessions, scribbled hastily on scraps of parchment, were so contradictory that the inquisitors themselves seemed to recognize the toll exacted by invisible torture. These torments were the culmination of the church's understanding of control. Physical punishment could break the body, but spiritual and social punishment could unmake the person entirely. By targeting identity, community, and the promise of salvation, the church wielded an invisible power far more enduring than pain alone. And for those who survived, the scars remained long after the body healed. Voices haunted by judgment, minds haunted by solitude, and souls haunted by fear. As we prepare for the final revelation, the last secret moves beyond instruments and rituals entirely, confronting the most disturbing legacy the church left behind: the idea that suffering itself could be sanctified. The 15th secret is not a tool, not a rack, not a fork or a flame. It is an idea. Perhaps the most insidious of all, this legacy of the church is the belief that suffering can be justified, sanctified, even demanded, in the pursuit of righteousness. Unlike hammers, spikes, or fire, this concept cannot be locked away or destroyed. It lives in thought, in law, in culture, quietly shaping behaviors long after the walls of dungeons have crumbled. Centuries of meticulously orchestrated terror taught that cruelty could serve a higher purpose, that pain was a conduit to truth, purification, or obedience. And once an institution normalizes such a notion, the human psyche begins to accept suffering as both inevitable and necessary. This principle, refined over centuries of inquisitions, public executions, and spiritual punishments, found its way into every corner of life. It justified coerced confessions, sanctioned social ostracism, and made cruelty ceremonial. The church's darkest gift was not the breaking of bodies, but the breaking of moral boundaries, convincing societies that pain could be righteous and punishment holy. It allowed men and women to inflict suffering with the certainty of virtue, and in doing so, they built a culture where terror became a tool of governance, masked in the rhetoric of salvation. History does not end with the collapse of medieval dungeons. The logic of fear, control, and sanctioned pain survives in modern institutions, though it is often invisible or abstracted. Surveillance, for example, is the descendant of public scrutiny in town squares. Watching, recording, and judging citizens in the name of safety recalls the gaze of inquisitors who observed confessions, calculated screams, and ensured obedience. Coercive interrogation, psychological pressure, and isolation echo the strategies perfected behind stone walls centuries ago. Social shaming and public cancellation are digital auto-da-fe, modern rituals where humiliation enforces compliance. Even state propaganda, ideological indoctrination, and religious extremism carry forward the same principle. Suffering, when framed as righteous or necessary, can control behavior more effectively than reason alone. Consider the moral shadow this leaves. Humanity has evolved technologically, politically, and culturally, yet the temptation to sanctify cruelty persists. In hospitals, prisons, schools, and online spaces, rules and rituals subtly shape behavior through fear, shame, or enforced obedience. Torture may be hidden behind bureaucratic walls rather than wrought in iron and flame, but the psychological architecture remains familiar. The Church's most enduring lesson was not how to break the body, it was how to fracture the mind, bend morality, and convince the living that suffering could serve a higher calling. Reflecting on this legacy, one must confront the quiet horror in modern life. We have inherited a system of belief in controlled pain, of sanctioned suffering, of obedience through fear, and we have refined it to operate in silence, far from torches and public squares. The screams of medieval victims may no longer echo in cobblestone streets, but the echoes persist in whispered threats, unseen punishments, and the invisible coercions that shape society. And perhaps the most unsettling question is not whether cruelty exists today, it is whether we recognize it when it is dressed in the robes of law, faith, or morality. As the shadows of the past reach into the present, the viewer is left with a choice: to accept the hidden cruelty that persists, to confront it with awareness, or to allow it to continue shaping society in silence. The Church's final secret was never a device. It was a lesson, one etched into human consciousness. Suffering can be justified if the hand that delivers it claims righteousness. And so we must ask ourselves, as we close the doors to this chapter of darkness, have we truly escaped the age of sanctioned cruelty, or have we merely learned to hide it behind screens, procedures, and solemn promises of virtue? The answer is not comforting, and the reflection is not easy, but understanding this shadow is the first step toward ensuring it no longer governs the living. Thanks for watching.